In Brazil, authorities continue facing the aftermath of devastating floods in southern regions of the country. In Argentina, educational sector on national strike demanding the reopening of discussions over salaries, among other issues. And this Saturday, May 25th, citizens worldwide celebrate Africa Day on this occasion with the theme Education Fit for the 21st Century. Hello, welcome to From the South. I'm Luis Alberto Matos from TeleSUR Studios in Havana, Cuba. We begin with the news. Weeks of deadly floods triggered by record-smashing rainfall have left part of southern Brazil in disaster. Our TeleSUR correspondent Brian Meir has the details.
3 weeks after Porto Alegre was hit with its biggest flood in history, not only are dozens of city blocks still submerged, but the water level started rising again on Thursday. During the 1960s, the local government built a huge flood prevention system. But on the day when the flooding began, the public found out that half the pumping stations were inoperable and that some of the gates designed to seal the dike system were missing parts and couldn't properly close.
Porto Alegre has seen its public services severely degraded over the past 20 years, destroyed by a governing coalition that believes that the state should be minimal and subordinate to the market.
In 1973, the Porto Alegre mayor's office created an agency called the Ministry of Rainwater Drainage. Like the rest of the integrated flood prevention system, it was well funded throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. After a right-wing coalition took control of the city government in 2005, it began systematically defunding the flood prevention system, eliminating the Ministry of Rainwater Drainage completely in 2017. We've known for a long time that if this system were properly maintained, it could have easily protected us from this flood because it could withstand a 6-meter rise in the river, and the highest level it reached this month was 5.33 meters. This flood would not have happened if everything was working. Once the flood prevention budget was gutted, current mayor Sebastian Mello began a push for a London-inspired port gentrification project. Ignoring a flood November that exposed mechanical failures in pumping station 17, Mayor Mello privatized a 3-kilometer section of the riverfront this February to real estate developers who promised to build fancy restaurants and rip down 1 kilometer of the flood wall.
There are much more modern systems than this wall. For example, you can install retractable plates that rise automatically during floods. So technology resolves this problem. In fact, I think that if we didn't still have this wall, the government would have already worked to solve the problem.
On Thursday, the Porto Alegre Residents Association's union filed an impeachment motion in City Council against Mayor Mello. Brian Meir, TeleSUR, Porto Alegre.
In our news, in Argentina, a new national strike at all levels of the educational system has started, demanding the reopening of discussions over salaries, among other issues. Our correspondent Juan Carlos Bartolota from Buenos Aires has all the details.
The general strike was called by the unions of the primary, intermediate, and university education sectors. The latter, in spite of the government's promises, is still awaiting definitions for the financing of university education.
It must be said that the conflict is far from over. It is necessary to solve the central budgetary problem of Argentina, which is the salary of teachers and non-teachers of the national universities. We have lost more than 50 points against inflation. We are the most punished sector in Argentina, and we believe that this is not a coincidence, but rather it responds to a political ideological festering that the president has with the public universities of Argentina, which have been and are a factor of critical discourse.
The teachers' claims have not ceased since the swearing-in of Javier Milei as president of the country, which is clearly shown by what is happening in Misiones, but also in other provinces that have been holding strikes for days.
We are in a national strike with a high level of compliance all over the country, even in the universities. We are demanding educational financing both for national universities and for the compulsory system, the reinstatement of the National Teachers Incentive Fund, and the increase of the compensation salary floor for teachers, the increase of the salary floor to compensate salary inequalities, which is very low, and it is 250,000 pesos.
In general, for teachers, the current situation is a regression to the 1990s when the adjustment policies of former President Carlos Menem were imposed.
It is almost a déjà vu of what we already lived in the 90s, which is educational underinvestment, persecution of popular leaders, adjustment in education. So, in that sense, sad for us because it is a big setback. We had conquered many rights, and this is a big setback for Argentina and for Latin America. So we are standing up. We are the teachers, the professors, the university professors, the female professors fighting, the universities. Today, the whole educational system is on strike, from the initial level to the university. Total stop, a strike all over the country.
This is the first unified strike of the educational system since the inauguration of the government of Javier Milei. The main demand is salary and budgetary, with a demand for the convening of the National Teachers Meeting to discuss the minimum salary for the sector, together with the restitution of the National Teachers Incentive Fund.
Juan Carlos Bartolota, TeleSUR, Argentina.
This Saturday, May 25th, citizens worldwide celebrate Africa Day, on this occasion with the theme Education Fit for the 21st Century. This year's theme aims to create an education system that not only meets the demands of the 21st century, but also ensures that every African child has the opportunity to thrive. Education is a cornerstone for Africa's growth and development, serving as a critical driver for socio-economic transformation and innovation. The theme aligns perfectly with Agenda 2063, the African Union's strategic framework for the continent's socio-economic transformation. On May 25, 1963, representatives of 30 African nations met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and founded the Organization of African Unity with the initial goal of encouraging the decolonization of Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa. In 2002, the Organization of African Unity was replaced by the current African Union. Let's take now a short break, but join us in our next segment for a special interview with Hakim Adi, historian of Africa and the African diaspora, to go over Pan-Africanism, its roots and future. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Let's go with our special interview with Hakim Adi, historian of Africa and the African diaspora.
And welcome to TeleSUR English. In this case, we are from Havana, Cuba, from the Casa de las Americas, the iconic Cuban cultural institution. And we are pleased to greet Professor Hakim Adi. He is here with us. He's a historian and specialized on history of Africa and the African diaspora. And thank you for joining us here in TeleSUR English. Hakim, we are pleased to have you here with us.
My great pleasure.
So I would like to start by asking you, what are we talking about when we talk about Pan-Africanism?
Pan-Africanism is a movement, an idea, really concerned with the liberation of Africa and the entire African diaspora, concerned with the unity of Africa and the African diaspora, in pursuit of its liberation. So it arose out of the conditions of colonialism, enslavement, racism, and so on, and really became an established movement at the beginning of the 20th century.
So in your studies, in your book, you cover, well, you've done a whole history of from the development, the origins and development of Pan-Africanism. And I would like to ask you about the particular significance that the countries in this region, from the Caribbean and also other regions from South America, like Brazil, for example. What can you tell us about the importance that this region of the world has played in the broader picture, the broader history of Pan-Africanism?
Well, particularly from the Caribbean, a country such as Haiti, which is in the news at the moment, played a very important part in the development of Pan-Africanism. We could say that the Haitian Revolution itself was a Pan-African act, in the sense that Africans from many parts of the continent who had been kidnapped, enslaved, taken to the Caribbean, organized themselves, spoke different languages, but came together in unity to overthrow the entire slave system, to defeat the armies of Britain, France, Spain, and so on, liberate themselves, and then create a haven for other Africans and a symbol of the independence of all Africans, a symbol of African liberation, African freedom. So countries like Haiti have played a very important role, and then people from the countries of the Caribbean and Latin America have also played a very important role in the development of Pan-Africanism. For example, somebody like Marcus Garvey in the 1920s played an important role, and there have been many others drawn from this region, from the American continent, as well as Africa and other parts of the world.
You've just mentioned that Haiti is, of course, in the news. It has been for quite some time, and particularly in this month. Do you have a read on the ongoing crisis that the Haitian people are currently going through and its links to this initial moment that you pictured as a first Pan-African revolution? Is there a link between the two instances in history?
Well, there's certainly a link in the sense that the big powers, initially France and then more recently the United States, have tried to stifle that liberation, stifle that independence. And many of Haiti's problems today are the direct result of the intervention of, we can say, US imperialism, as well as the other big powers, France, Canada, and others, who have created the very conditions which exist in Haiti today, and having created the conditions, then say that they wish to intervene to change those conditions. But the essence is that they've created the problem and cannot solve it, and it should be left for the people of Haiti, with their friends, of course, to solve the problems that are facing Haiti today.
And Professor Hakim, one of your areas of study has also been the link between Pan-Africanism and communism. I wanted to ask you about that link. First of all, about your desire to explore that relationship between the two. What drew you to that link?
Well, often things have been presented in such a way that it would appear that there is a division or a difference between these two movements. But Pan-Africanism is concerned with the unity and liberation of Africa and its diaspora. Communism is concerned with the liberation of the workers, the toilers of all countries. And so there's a clear interconnection between the two. And particularly in the early 20th century, when many people from the African diaspora in the US, in the Caribbean, as well as in Africa, were looking to find ways of affecting their liberation. They were greatly inspired by the communist movement, and particularly by the events that had taken place in Russia, then the Soviet Union. They said to themselves, if the people of Russia, the ordinary workers and farmers of Russia, can liberate themselves, then this has got to be a good thing for us, and perhaps we can liberate ourselves by following a similar example. And of course, they were encouraged and inspired by the creation of the communist movement, the Communist International, which then tried to assist and intervene in those struggles in Africa, the Caribbean, and other places, and encourage that unity and encourage people to struggle for their liberation, but in collaboration with the struggles of people of all countries. So I think that's the connection between the two movements.
And do you believe that, can we think Pan-Africanism as being inherently anti-imperialist, or are there different ways of approaching, or have there been different ways of approaching the idea of Pan-Africanism?
Pan-Africanism is a broad movement. In my book, I say it's like a river with many different streams and currents. Broadly speaking, yes, we could say it is a movement opposed to colonialism, opposed to racism, opposed to imperialism. But, of course, some people, some organizations take slightly different routes to that liberation, slower routes, we could say. For example, today we have a Pan-African organization such as the African Union, the organization of the countries of Africa in particular, but which also includes the diaspora. The African Union was established ostensibly as a bulwark against imperialism, against neoliberal globalization. But of course, because of the actual situation in the world, it's very difficult for those African countries the governments of which are tied to the imperialist system of states in one way or another, to actually operate in a united and organized way for the benefit of all the people of Africa and the diaspora too. So you have there a contradiction, a Pan-African organization attempting to develop that unity, attempting to affect that liberation, but in a very slow way and continually impacted by, as I say, the big powers, the imperialist system of states. So that contradiction exists.
Mm-hmm. And of course, when you studied the relationship between Pan-Africanism and communism, you focused your research on the decades of the 20s and 30s and the 20th century. But we're here in Havana, and I cannot avoid to ask you about Cuba and its role in this broader picture of what you're studying as Pan-Africanism, thinking Cuba as not only a country in the Caribbean that has brought about and sustained a socialist revolution, but has also made concerted efforts of supporting and continue to this day to do concerted efforts of supporting the struggles of the people in Africa and the African continent. So what is your read on Cuba?
Well, Cuba has been and continues to be a very, very important country, unique really in the world in this period and in the previous period. So a great inspiration to those people within Africa, in other parts of the Caribbean, globally, to the African diaspora, an example of the possibility of liberation. And then, as you hinted, it also played a very important role in the liberation struggles in Africa, particularly in places like Angola, Mozambique, Guinea, a very important role in the final elimination of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So Cuba has that role, and I think certainly in the time of Fidel, it saw its positioning, its involvement in Africa as, if you like, connecting the struggles of Cubans, many of whom of African heritage, with the struggles in the African continent. But I think it remains, perhaps more importantly today, it remains an example of what a small country can do, even though blockaded by the biggest imperialist power in the world. It can still exist, it can still make progress despite all the difficulties and so on. I think the most important thing about Cuba today is it shows us an alternative, because the big powers continually present the view that there is only their imperialist system of states, there's only neoliberalism, there's only the capital-centered system. But Cuba shows that there is another way, and even under that blockade of so many decades, that there are great possibilities. And one imagines if there wasn't that blockade, what kind of country Cuba would be. It would be an even greater example to the rest of the world.
So, Professor Adi, in closing, I would like to ask you about how you view the current world in which the Global South has been striving to encourage relationships between, besides other countries, also countries in the African continent and the Latin American continent, the Caribbean region. For example, here in Havana last year was the G77 and China summit, in which many African leaders participated and talked about the importance of relations between Latin America, Caribbean, and the African continent. How do you view this possible connection, this present for the Global South, in the view of what we've been talking about so far?
Potentially it's very important. In fact, the first time I came to Cuba was for a G77 meeting. I remember it very well. Fidel spoke and gave this, what can you say, very inspiring speech about the world being like a ship. And essentially he said in that analogy, unless the peoples of the world came together and took over the ship, it would sail into an iceberg. So I think that image is very important. Yes, the relations between governments are extremely important, but also the relationship between peoples of the world, the peoples of the global south finding ways of coming together, organizing themselves, uniting to change the world. Because as we're seeing with Haiti, for example, sometimes the countries of the south are a bit confused about where their interests lie, or where the interests of their people lie, or where the interests of the people of the countries of the global south lie. So the involvement of the people, unleashing that, the human factor, you could say, is so important, and finding ways of doing that, which countries like Cuba or Venezuela or Brazil or Colombia or others can play a very important role, but as I say, always utilizing the strength, the unity, the possibilities of the people themselves to change the situation. I think that's the key thing.
Professor, I would like to thank you on behalf of TeleSUR English for joining us for this great conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us.
My pleasure, thank you.
And like this, we come to a close on this great conversation with Professor Adi, and we stay here with TeleSUR English. Stay with us.
That was Hakim Adi, historian of Africa and the African diaspora. Like this, we have come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. Also join us on social media, Facebook, X, Instagram, Telegram, and TikTok. For TeleSUR English, I'm Luis Alberto Matos. Thank you for watching.